Hello, and thanks for joining me today. My name's Jeff, and you're listening to episode 19 of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. Hello, and welcome back to another edition of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. My name is Jeff, and today's Comic Book of the Day is Limited Collector's Edition number C47, and this was published in 1976, September of 1976, which meant, the cover date was 1976 and September. So we'll back out August, we'll back out June, and we'll back out to July. So July 1976. So let's think, all right? Let's put our thinking caps on and think what was going on in July of 1976. Well, if you answered the American Bicentennial, then you are absolutely correct. This is Superman Celebrates the Bicentennial, right? This is a treasury book, meaning that it's the large 10 inches by 13 inches. It is the DC Comics Treasury Edition. It was somewhere, let's see. I would probably put it at about maybe number 20 or so, maybe 30 or so into the series of Treasury books that DC published in the 70s. So the Treasury comic had been around for a little while when DC decided to publish this one, and this one is Superman, and it's a celebration of the American Bicentennial. Now, I don't remember too much about the American Bicentennial. I was around. I was a younger kid at the time. A much younger kid, I might add. And this was prior to my comic book collecting days, so I don't recall owning this as a child. I don't recall that this is a comic book that I actually owned as a child. This was put together many years later when I was trying to put together a collection of Treasury comics. I fell in love with Treasury comics as a kid, and then later on in my adulthood, I realized that the Treasury comics were something that I really wanted to start trying to track down and start trying to get my hands on. And the DC Treasury comics were far and away the books that I wanted to get my hands on, because those were the ones that I remembered. Marvel did Treasury comics. You know, they probably did about 30 or so. DC probably did about maybe 50% more. DC was much more heavily invested into the Treasury format than Marvel was. Marvel did some large format books. I think the one that really, really jumps to mind that I absolutely remember having and getting my hands on was the Star Wars series of Treasury books. Those were, I think, of all of the Marvel Treasury books that I had when I was a kid, I think it was the oversized Treasury edition of Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. 3 separate Treasury books that I got my hands on as a kid, but the list of Treasury books that I had and collected, or at least remember owning at some time in my youth, was large and varied. I recall at separate times having the famous first editions. This is a large format Treasury book that reprints from cover to cover the original Golden Age first appearance of the various superheroes. There's a famous first edition Action Comics number 1. There's a Detective 27 famous first editions. Sensation Comics first appearance of Wonder Woman. Wiz Comics first appearance of Captain Marvel, Shazam. There's a Batman number 1 famous first edition. There's a Wonder Woman famous first edition. Believe it or not, there's actually an All-Star Comics famous first edition, which is the first appearance of the Justice Society. There's a Flash, a Golden Age Flash famous first edition, which is quite awesome. And then I believe there's a Superman number 1 famous first edition that reprints the Golden Age Superman number 1. These were cover-to-cover reprints, so they were blown up, oversized reprints, and they had a famous first edition cover on the cover. So you had a Treasury famous first edition cover on the front cover, and then when you opened up the front cover, you got the you got the interior. You got a second interior cover that was a what is it? It was a coated paper stock cover, similar to what comic book covers would be. And then the interior was newsprint. So it was, a thick sort of cardboard cover that the first one, they had heavy, it's not cardboard, it's cardstock. So it's a thicker, heavier cover for Treasury books. And then inside you had the shiny coated, slick cover, right? Which was the exact reprint of the comic book inside, and then inside you had newsprint, which was essentially a reprint of the entire comic book from cover to cover. Those were some of my favorites. Look, I'm going to be honest. Comic book of the day, the idea was that we would sort of randomly pick comics, and good or bad, we would talk about a different comic book every day and talk about it. And unfortunately, I don't want to say that this is a bad book, right? I don't want to say that Superman C47 Limited Treasury Edition, Superman Celebrates the Bicentennial, is necessarily a bad book. But I don't know if I would necessarily go whole hog and say that it is a terrific book. What I will say, and I think as I conclude this podcast, I think I'm going to go back to the website and upload the back cover to this book. What I'll do is I'll take a picture of the back cover and I'll upload that to the website, comicbookoftheday.com, if you're following along, and you can see the back of this cover, because this limited Treasury edition is absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, a perfect example of judging a book by its cover, right? So it is absolutely one of the most beautiful covers that you've ever seen. I mean, it is a classic Superman cover. It dates from, I believe, it's a Fred Ray cover. It's been listed. I've seen it in various. I've seen it in various lists and various books and various discussions around some of the best comic book covers of all time, and it is, I think, a wonderful example of Golden Age Superman and a beautiful example of a classic Superman cover. It's an old school Golden Age Superman. This is by the artist Fred Ray. It is a classic old school Golden Age Superman with an American shield back behind him, right? He's standing in front of an American shield, and he's got an eagle on his arm. So this is, 100% America, right? Like this is 100% America. And then the back cover is absolutely fantastic. It is a collection of headshots, or a collection of drawings of all of the presidents of the United States, and starting with George Washington and ending with Gerald Ford, right? So the last, at the time that this was published, Gerald Ford was president. I remember the one memory that I do have about the Bicentennial is that at some point Gerald Ford came to Richmond, Virginia, and it might have been, I believe there might have been a presidential yeah, it makes sense. There was a presidential election that year. It would have been Jimmy Carter who won the 76 presidential election, and then he was superseded by Reagan in 80. So this might have been a campaign stop for Gerald Ford at the time in 1976. And I lived in Richmond, Virginia growing up when I was a younger kid, and I remember Gerald Ford coming to the Richmond Capitol, maybe. I believe it was somewhere downtown, and my dad took me to see President Ford. I went with my dad and my younger sister at the time, and we went and saw the President of the United States, and that was, I believe, during the Bicentennial. I don't really remember anything much about the Bicentennial celebration. I'm sure it was a huge celebration. I seem to recall fireworks in the Hudson River at some point, or maybe Boston Harbor or something. I recall watching on television, I think as a young kid, watching a fireworks display for the Bicentennial. But I do recall that growing up in Richmond, Virginia, we did have Bicentennial fever. There was a lot of there was a lot of American colonial Revolutionary War inspired stuff that was going on at the time. I seem to recall Schoolhouse Rock was really kind of big then, where they would do geography rocks and they do history rocks, and they would talk about America and the Great American Melting Pot and all of those fun little cartoons that you would see on the weekends and on Saturday morning on the cartoons. And then I recall, there was just a general spirit of 1976. I think we probably went to Washington, D.C. that year, and, we made our way to Williamsburg, Virginia, and Jamestown, and Monticello and Mount Vernon. So living in Virginia during 1976 was a pretty decent time to be, Merc and enjoying, the celebrations of America's bicentennial 200th birthday. But this one, the interior of this book, not so much. It's a reprinting of Tomahawk stories. I think an older Indian inspired, Western Indian inspired, Daniel Boone kind of inspired comic strip. And they're okay. I mean, they're okay stories. But man, boy, does the cover of this book just sell it. I mean, you can head over to comicbookoftheday.com and check out this cover and see what I mean. You'll definitely agree that this is, one of the quintessential patriotic American Superman covers, if you will. This book is currently valued in Overstreet and 9.2. It's valued at about $26, I believe it is, about $26 in 9.2 near mint. If you were able to locate this book in 9.0, you could grab it for about $20. All the way down to, a fine copy in 6.0 will run you just under $10. It'll cost you about $9 to get your hands on a copy of this. So, I would love to tell you to go out and buy this book, but I mean, quite honestly, I think, for the money that, for $10, $15 of your money, you could probably find you a better book, unless you are like me and you are a completist and you have to get your hands on every single treasury comic that exists, which is something that I was shooting for at the time. So I'm very proud to own it because it completes my collection of treasury comics. But I spent a little bit of time thumbing through this book and was sort of hard pressed to make my way all the way through it. So, but regardless, check it out. Head over to comicbookoftheday.com and check out the cover and see what you think. I think it is a wonderful cover. Definitely telephone wallpaper material. Something you could put on your cell phone. On your cell phone wallpaper, I think it'd be pretty cool to have. So yeah, take a look at it. Head over to comicbookoftheday.com and give it a look. See what you think. You can also follow along on Facebook at Comic Book of the Day. We are also on Instagram, Comic Book of the Day as well, and on Twitter, CB of the Day. We would love for you to subscribe to us on iTunes and Google Play to follow along. I think it would be tremendously fun if you were able to sort of keep up with each day's podcast and sort of give us a 10 or 15 minutes of your time every day and listen to some fun stories about comics. But yeah, thank you once again for joining us today for the Comic Book of the Day. Superman salutes the Bicentennial. Thanks a lot, and we will see you again tomorrow.